Hello, welcome back. This is our fourth session of our study in the book of Daniel, Wisdom in Exile. And tonight we're going to be looking, this session we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 3, which is one of the most popular and famous stories in the Bible. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Let me share my screen here. Hmm. Well, I apologize there. Let's see. Okay. Okay, there we go. All right. Sorry. I'm trying to record it in a different way. I'm going live, which obviously you can see means that I can make more mistakes and I don't get to start over. So anyway, back to the beginning. This session we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3, one of the most popular stories in all of the Bible, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And just to get everybody back up to speed, you'll remember that our friends have had some harrowing times since coming to Babylon or being taken to Babylon. They had felt intense pressure to assimilate, to become Babylonians. They had, in spite of that pressure, in spite of all just complete change of their surroundings, they had been faithful to the Lord. Last week, we saw that their lives were actually in danger when King Nebuchadnezzar had a troubling dream that none of his wise men could discern or interpret. But through Daniel, the mystery of the king's dream was revealed. But more than just his dream, through Daniel's faithful testimony about the source of his wisdom, the source of his interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar learned about the God in heaven, the God of Daniel, Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah. He learned about the God who in heaven who reveals mysteries. And at the end of chapter 2, the king glorifies God. He says, truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. So we see there at the end, King Nebuchadnezzar gives glory to God. He gives high honor to Daniel. Daniel gets a promotion. He then turns around and is able to promote his three friends, and then everyone just lived happily ever after. Not so fast. We get into chapter 3 tonight. We'll see that while sometimes, as in the case of the first couple of chapters of the book, we'll see that while sometimes faithfulness leads to favor, other times faithfulness leads to the furnace. One thing I want to say, when we read Old Testament books and Old Testament stories, we have a tendency to turn these stories into allegories or morality tales. They give us an example of how we're supposed to live. We don't really read them as historical events, things that happened. And so when we do that, and that's not always a bad thing, but when we do that, we might be tempted to ask a question like, "What is your fiery furnace?" Oops, I'm sorry. Man, I messed up. Let me go through the reading real quick, and then we'll get back into that. Sorry about this. Okay, I'm going to read through Daniel chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors and the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, all the officials of the province to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then King Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And then who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? And they answered and said to the king, True, O king. He answered and said, But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and has delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make a decree any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So that's chapter 3 of the book of Daniel. And as I was saying before I read, when we read these Old Testament stories, we can turn them into kind of allegories or morality tales that are whose sole purpose is to teach us how we're supposed to live. And when we do that, it might lead us to ask questions like, what is what is your fiery furnace? And that's not necessarily a bad way to think about these stories or to apply them to our lives, but it's really important to understand that that's not the main point of this story. When we compare ourselves to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we should remember that for them, the fiery furnace was the fiery furnace. And I just speaking personally, I don't have anything that really has compared to that level of a threat or a danger. You see, this story is not primarily about how we go through hard times or how we suffer. It's really about suffering because you refuse to bow down to the idols of the world. So rather than asking, what is my fiery furnace? A better question might be to ask, what is my golden image? When you read chapter 3 and you think back about what happened in the previous chapter, in chapter 2, it can kind of cause whiplash. You'll remember that in chapter 2, he has this dream of this great image that is destroyed by a rock or a stone that is not cut by any human hand. And the dream gives him all sorts of anxiety and consternation. And when the dream is interpreted, the message is fairly simple. It is this, that empires fall. It is the message to Nebuchadnezzar is your life's going to come to an end. Your empire is going to come to an end. And not only will your empire fall, but the empires that follow you will ultimately fall. And at the end of the chapter, Nebuchadnezzar gives glory to God as the God of gods and the Lord of kings. But then here we are in the very next chapter, and what's he doing? He's setting up a golden image, and he's commanding that this image, this statue, be worshiped by everyone. Well, what's going on? Does he have some kind of amnesia? How could he forget what he learned in chapter 2? Well, he doesn't have amnesia exactly. One thing you have to keep in mind when you're reading through this book of Daniel is that it's not the purpose of it is not an exhaustive picture of ancient Babylon or the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel and his friends were taken to Babylon at a very young age, and it was very early in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And history tells us that Nebuchadnezzar reigned in Babylon for over 40 years. But we have a tendency to read it like it all happened over the span of a week. You know, Monday they get taken into Babylon and they refuse to eat the king's food, and then Tuesday Daniel interprets this dream, and then boom, Wednesday they're Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown in the fiery furnace. But the reality is, we don't have any idea how much time passed between chapters 2 and 3. Was it months? Was it years? It very well could have been a fairly significant amount of time before we get to the events of chapter 3. Well, you might say, well, yeah, sure. But even so, how could King Nebuchadnezzar forget such a significant event, this revelation, this dream reveal, this revelation from God? Well, I think there's a really, really important lesson here for all of us. The very first thing Jesus said when he was delivering the famous Sermon on the Mount was, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, King Nebuchadnezzar was a lot of things, but poor in spirit was not one of them. Why do you think Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven"? Let me ask you, just think about this question. Does God love poor people more than he loves rich people? I don't think he does. I think he loves people. I think his desire for people is that they be saved. So what is Jesus talking about here when he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit"? What is the characteristic of these people that leads to blessedness? Well, I think there's a lot of ways to be maybe say wealthy in spirit, the opposite of what Jesus is describing. Obviously, one of the main ways is when we have a lot of monetary wealth, when we're rich. But it can also, it doesn't, that's not the only way. It can also be kind of a moral wealth when we are just good by the world's estimation and definition. When we just get along well with people and we have relational wealth with people, when life just kind of is easy for us, so easy, in fact, that we never really get around to dealing with sinfulness or dealing with how we're reconciled to God. When there's a lot of ways to not be poor in spirit. And I think it really boils down to anything that we can take and that we can kind of put together piecemeal, prop up to be our kingdom, the kingdom of Dale instead of the kingdom of God. That's the opposite of what Jesus is describing when he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Well, at any rate, Nebuchadnezzar was not poor in spirit. And the result for him, and I think the result for all of us, is sort of a spiritual amnesia. We kind of forget. It's easy for us to forget the Lord whenever we are rich in our own spirits. There's a old song that says, "When you've got nothing to lose." Well, on the contrary, when we've got something, sometimes when we've got just anything that we can hang on to, um, we've got something that we have to hold on to, and that we can sort of work into being our glory, our righteousness, our kingdom, what makes us worthwhile, that keeps us from that place of admitting that we are poor in spirit. I think everyone is ultimately poor in spirit before the throne of God, but there's a lot of ways that we can be distracted. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had a lot to hold on to, and he had a lot that he needed to hold on to. This is a map of what was the Babylonian Empire. This is what he was responsible for. This huge landmass was the Babylonian Empire. He had fought so hard to build this. And here's the thing, I think, about ancient empires. They were hard to get, but they were really hard to keep. In some ways, maybe harder to keep. You have this expansive landmass populated by a lot of different people, a lot of different types of people, many of whom, maybe most of whom, became your subjects because you beat them. You defeated them militarily. So, how do you keep all of these people spread out over this huge area? How do you keep them happy, productive, and relatively loyal? Babylon is this huge empire, a monument to human strength, to human innovation, but in many ways it was hanging by a thread. How could Nebuchadnezzar hold this all together? Well, think about chapter 2 and the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, this image that he dreamt about. It was a statue, you'll remember, made up of all these different materials, gold and silver and bronze and iron, and it represented the Babylonian Empire and then all the empires that would follow after Babylon. Well, what was the weakness in this statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream? It was the feet, if you'll remember, the feet that were a mixture of iron and clay. And Daniel tells us in his interpretation of the dream what this represents. It was a divided kingdom. And Daniel described it as partly strong and partly brittle. There's another word for something that is partly strong and partly brittle, and that word is brittle, right? I mean, if any part of it is brittle, it's really, in essence, all brittle. And I suspect that that image, that weakness, was in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, and he was just thinking that was the thing that allowed this whole grand statue to come falling down. Well, according to Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, there's an empire that's going to come after Babylon. And I think Nebuchadnezzar thought about that dream, thought about the weakness in the feet. And he saw potential weakness in Babylon because what was Babylon? It was this conglomeration, this huge landmass and group of all these different peoples, nations, and languages, varied and disparate cultures, races of people, and he's Nebuchadnezzar is trying to contain them all. He's trying to rule over them all. So how can he get this diverse group of people to fall in line? Well, he has an idea, and it's not a really particularly original idea, but he has an idea, and he builds a golden image. This thing's 90 feet tall, it's 9 feet wide, and he sets it up on the plain of Dura, very, pretty much in the same place geographically where we read about the Tower of Babel back in Genesis. And he invites all of his appointed officials from the provinces of the empire. All these different officers and the satraps and the treasurers and all these different people from the provinces of the empire. Well, who are all of these people? I would I think that most of these officials were not from Babylon. They were coming from far off places, far away in the far corners of the empire. They've been brought in from all around the empire. You see, part of maintaining these sprawling empires was you had to get somebody, typically somebody local, to manage things in these different districts. You might remember we talked about the king of Judah at the time whenever Daniel was taken into Babylonian exile. His name was Jehoiakim, and we read in 2 Kings chapter 24 that for a period of time he was a servant or a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar in Jerusalem. Now he still held the title of king of Judah, but he was a servant of Nebuchadnezzar. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. You had to find someone who wanted to hold on to some measure of power, but that was subservient to the empire. It helped to have somebody that was local, somebody that knew their way around, somebody that knew how to keep the trains running on time, someone who could collect the taxes and send tribute and the resources of whatever the district produced back to the capital. Another example of a vassal would probably be King Herod. We read about in the Gospels during the time when Jesus was born. We read about Herod and his sons. They were Jewish by race, but they were loyal to Rome. That's kind of what we're talking about. These people from the areas that had been defeated and consolidated into this great empire. Um, some leaders would be appointed and put in power as long as they were ultimately loyal to Babylon. So this group of officials was varied in terms of race, culture, and national identity, and they would represent the leadership of every corner of the Babylonian Empire. And then Nebuchadnezzar calls them all together for this big event, this dedication of the grand golden image. And then the Bible tells us that he brings us this array of instruments, probably from all over the empire, or maybe all over the world. The music mixes at this event, all these different musical instruments. The culture mixes, everything comes together. There's this loud blast of music, and everybody, in essence, what I think they're doing, they're casting off their primary allegiance to their nation and to their gods, and they're bowing down in worship to the golden image. They come together, united, harmonious people, bound together by ties of political loyalty, religious zeal, and cultural pride. I think it was a little bit like they're saying, I stand as a fill in the blank. I stand as an Egyptian, as an Assyrian, as a Hebrew, but I'm bowing and I'm worshiping and I'm a Babylonian. And the idea is unity, uniformity, all gold, no clay, to make the kingdom durable, not weak like those feet in his dream of iron mixed with clay. I think that is what is going on here. He's going for uniformity, durability, and strength all across his empire. He had his dream and he got the point. The Lord revealed the dream to him through Daniel, but then he sort of lost the point because of this overwhelming concern. How can I keep my kingdom together? Well, we don't read about Daniel in chapter 3. I don't know if you've ever noticed that or not, but we don't. He doesn't show up at all in chapter 3. I don't think that means at all that he was willing to bow down to the statue. Um, my theory on that, and that's what's worth, you know, I guess that's not worth a whole lot, but my theory is that at the end of chapter 2, we're told that Daniel remains in the king's court, while Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were sent out to govern provinces. It makes sense to me that these three men who were out governing over a province, maybe they were not as far from Babylon as some folks, but they're all subject to the call for national unity. They're subject to come to the plain of Dura to bow down to the image, to just unite all these different and diverse people groups under unity under Babylon and this golden image. when I read chapter 3, you may be different, but I don't really see that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are being really boisterous or outspoken in their resistance. They're not protesting. They're not carrying a sign around or a placard. It seems to me that they're simply not participating. We don't see them going around gathering signatures on a petition. They just aren't taking part in this dedication ceremony. When my kids were small, they watched VeggieTales, and if you've ever seen the VeggieTales telling of this story, Rack, Shack, and Benny, and they're all out there on this big open plain, and there's the golden image, and everybody bows down, and then the three of them are just standing there, kind of sticking out like sore thumbs. But as I read the text, it seems like it's possible at least they just didn't go to the event. They didn't participate. At any rate, they're not caught rebelling or stirring up trouble. They are caught because they are accused, it says, by certain Chaldeans who tell Nebuchadnezzar, these men pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship your golden image that you have set up. Well, this is a problem. This is a real problem for Nebuchadnezzar. These men are not obeying the king, but more than that, they are his guys. He knows Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are incredibly valuable to the king. They've done really good work. You might remember in chapter 1 and verse 20, after Daniel and these three friends are go through the training program to fit them for service in Babylon, the Bible tells us that they're 10 times better than all the other magicians and enchanters in the kingdom. So they have the king's respect, and they had received honor from him. But then here they are, they're not bowing down. The king's command was, if you don't bow down, you are immediately to be thrown into the fiery furnace. But he gives Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego another chance. He's angry, he's furious, but he wants to give them another shot to be obedient to him. Shadrach and Abednego say, we don't need to go back out on the plain of Dura. You don't have to warm up the bagpipes. You don't even have to get the trigon out of the case. We can settle this right here. They say, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, if you're going to throw us in the fiery furnace, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Well, last time we talked about how calm and cool Daniel was in these high pressure situations. And we see something like that here with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the face of this terrifying death, to just be thrown alive into this intense burning fire. They calmly say, we're not going to bow down. We're not going to do it. They're faithful to God, but no, their faithfulness is not conditional on God's favor. They're not saying, we believe, therefore we shall receive. We believe, therefore we know God's going to deliver us. They know he can. And really what they're basically saying is the Lord is God. The Lord is God. We bow down to him. We're not going to bow down to that 90-foot eyesore you put out on the plain of Dura. We're not going to do it. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was angry before. It said he was already in a furious rage. But after this response, which I just picture it being pretty matter of fact, pretty calm, he is filled with fury. And his whole attitude, it says the expression of his face was changed against them, because these were his guys. He thought highly of them, and he's done some nice things for them. He's given them promotions, and now he sees that they've betrayed him. Well, the temperature on the furnace goes up. He orders it heated 7 times hotter than normal. And these soldiers, these strong, mighty men, they bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And as they're carrying them to the furnace, the heat is so intense, the flames are so out of control that the fire kills the strong soldiers, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall into the furnace. They're fully dressed, they're bound. It's just this incredibly intense moment. And I just picture Nebuchadnezzar, after they fall into the fire and then he sees this chaos unfolding before him, he just sort of slumps back in his throne, still just angry because these Hebrew slaves who he had blessed so much would dare to defy him. But then he looks into the fire and he cannot believe his eyes. He asks, "Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire?" And his officials answered, "True, O king." Well, now Nebuchadnezzar has a whole new problem. He sees 4 men, and none of them are bound, and none of them are burned. And they're just walking around in the midst of the fire. And one of them is like a son of the gods. He calls to them, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." And these 3 men, just as calm as before, walk out of the fire. Understandably, everybody gathers around them. All these people from all over the empire of Babylon. They gather around to see how this could possibly be. Their bodies, their skin, their clothes, not even a single hair of their heads was singed. They didn't even smell like smoke, and the fire had no effect on them at all. Well, that's actually not true. Their ropes were gone. They're no longer bound. Such an interesting detail. The fire burned away their bonds. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar, in this amazing deliverance of these men who he was trying to kill, he remembers everything he forgot from the end of chapter 2, and he says, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except for their own God." He goes on, "Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." The king remembers who God is. And again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are promoted. The king, it doesn't seem to me, he gives glory to God, but I don't think he's saying, "I'm going to become a worshiper of God. I'm no longer going to worship all these gods of Babylon." I think Marduk or all the different gods of Babylon. He's basically saying it's okay for people to worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which makes you think, what were the I mean, again, we have all these people coming from all over the empire, and now he gives this order. What were the ramifications for the people of God spread out all over the empire? People who didn't have anywhere near as much influence as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or near as much influence as Daniel, that King Nebuchadnezzar said, "You can't say anything against this God. And if you do, you're going to get your arms and legs ripped off." That was kind of like we saw last time. That's kind of his go-to move. Tearing people apart and then tearing their house down. But would that have blessed other Hebrews that were all spread throughout the empire? So the king remembers Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are promoted, and the chapter comes to an end. Well, this is an ancient story about an ancient ruler of an ancient empire. Does it have anything to say to us today? Well, I think it actually has quite a bit to say to us today. The challenge that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced was not, you can't worship the Lord. It wasn't that you have to reject your faith, and instead of that, you have to worship the golden image, which was Babylon. It was really what we might call pluralism. It was worshiping the Lord plus worshiping Babylon. They didn't have to give anything up. They just have to add something too. They were not commanded to turn away from their worship of Yahweh. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar was probably fine with them worshiping the Lord. Based on the end of chapter 2, he was a little bit of a fan. He was kind of a fan of the Lord. They could still worship whoever they wanted so long as they worshiped the image. the golden image, this 90-foot by 9-foot statue. What was that? What was that image about? Um, it was not an idol in the traditional sense. It did not represent any of the Babylonian gods. You'll remember that when the men accuse Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they say they do not serve your gods or or worship the golden image that you have set up. They draw a line, they draw a distinction. They don't serve your gods or the golden image that you have set up. So what is this image? I think it is a national cultural idol. It represents Babylon. It represents the strength and the innovation and the wisdom of Babylon. They're commanded to worship the culture. They're commanded to worship the empire of Babylon. Well, let me ask you, think about it. Are we tempted today to bow down to a cultural idol? I think yes, right? And we see it everywhere. We see it on both ends of the political spectrum. On the conservative end of the spectrum, there is a call to kind of a nationalism that conflates country with kingdom and views the United States as God's chosen nation. Now, I believe that the United States is a wonderful country. I think we have the absolute best system of government, as messy and as frustrating as it often is. I think it's the best system of government in the entire world. And I believe if you go back and read history under our system of government, which has always allowed for religious freedom, Christianity sprouted and grew in this soil in incredible ways, and the result has been a blessing to the whole world. I would challenge anybody on that. We're not perfect, but on the whole, it's been a blessing to the world. So there's nothing unchristian about being patriotic. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah lived out the command of Jeremiah 29, verse 7, which was all about how they were supposed to live as exiles. And again, Jeremiah 29 and verse 7 says, "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." They served Babylon well. They were loyal to the empire as far as they could possibly be. As Christians, our faith in Jesus should actually make us better citizens. But we should always consider the limits of patriotism and seek discernment for when it moves into the area of idolatry. We have to remember that the only kingdom that will endure is the kingdom of God. It's not our nation. I don't think we're going to be Americans in the kingdom of God when we enter into glory. I think we're going to be we're not going to have that national identity anymore. And so Christians are Americans best when they are disciples first. But there are certainly idols on the other end of the political spectrum. On that end, we see this idol of progressive ideology. We're told that we live in a that we're told that we shouldn't talk about religion. It's one of those things you're not supposed to talk about in public. We live in a secular society. Religion is a private matter and should be kept separate from public life. But the real irony is that adherents to this progressive civil religion are in many cases as fundamentalist, if not more, than the people that they attack. It's a religion. I just look around and see um, it is a religion. It's a faith with its own creeds, sacraments, saints, and holy days. And it takes many forms, but it's really a worship of self-identity, worship of bodily autonomy, worship of nature in many cases. And there's just this overwhelming, intolerant demand to tolerate everything. And while people on this side often invoke the separation of church and state, discipleship in this secular church is being preached all around us all the time in public, in schools, in our media, in commercials, in business practices. It's even preached in some churches. And there's just an intensifying pressure to bow down. Well, the root of both of these extremes, whether conservative or more liberal, is basically, I believe, Babylon. It's the same thing that was going on in ancient Babylon. We talked about in the our first time we met together. What is that about? What is Babylon? We're coming together to make a name for ourselves. This idol of human progress and potential separated from faithfulness and relationship with God. Oftentimes, when we think about persecution, we think about a pressure to deny our faith, to reject our faith. But the reality for most of us is not to deny our faith, but rather to dilute our faith, to water it down. For the most part, people don't really care if you're a Christian so long as you keep it in the right place and you still pay tribute to the national, cultural, and social gods. Perhaps the greatest challenge and temptation we face is not the pressure to reject our faith, but the consistent pressure to compromise. We need to live faithfully understanding that at times our faithfulness will lead to favor, and other times faithfulness will lead to the furnace. Because I don't know about you, but it seems like the pressure is going up. And when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go into the furnace, this is such an important point. When they go into the furnace, they are not alone. There is a fourth person with them. And who is it? Nebuchadnezzar says it is like a son of the gods. Later, he describes the being as an angel sent by God. Who is this fourth person? It's a mysterious thing, and scholars don't know for sure, but I'll tell you, I believe this is Jesus Christ. I believe this is the pre incarnate Christ. Jesus, we're told in the Gospel of Matthew, is Emmanuel, God with us. And this was God with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And where was he with them? In the furnace. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in the furnace, what are they doing? Nebuchadnezzar said, I see four men unbound walking in the midst of the fire. What are they doing? They're walking with the Lord in the fire. The Lord meets them in the furnace. There's a great contemporary Christian song. Um, encourage you to look it up. It's a really good song, but it's called "And There Was Another in the Fire." And I want to read you the last chorus. The chorus changes a little bit each time, but the last chorus goes like this: There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the water, holding back the sea. And should I ever need reminding of how good you've been to me, I'll count the joy come every battle, because I know that's where you'll be. The Lord was with them in the fire, in the furnace, in the moment of greatest difficulty. Well, this story is an example and it is a call for us to live faithfully. Here's a quote by a man named Jeremy Treat that I found really encouraging. And I kind of wanted to close with this. He said, Christianity is deeply personal, but it's not private. Jesus died for us in public. We're called to live for him in public. And I think that's true. And I think we need to remember that. Well, I hope this study of chapter 3 has been a blessing to you. If you're watching this because you weren't able to attend last night, but you're planning to come in person, I just want to let you know we're not going to meet next week. There's some other stuff going on in the room, the Langford room where we're meeting, and so we are not going to be meeting again until July 14th. If you've been watching these on YouTube, I will plan to post on July 15th, the next time. We're going to get into chapter 4, where we will read Nebuchadnezzar in his own words, his testimony about the Most High God. And if you've been blessed by this study, and if it's gotten you into the book of Daniel and you've been reading on your own, I just want to encourage you to think about, what is the Lord teaching King Nebuchadnezzar? I mean, these four young men, they're brought to Babylon, and And we just continually, each chapter, it's like we see the pride and violence of this powerful king who seems to be able to do anything he wants to do in terms of his empire, and he just continually runs up against the power of the Most High God of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And next time we get together on July 14th, or here on YouTube on the 15th, we'll see how the message finally breaks through to this king. Well, I hope this has been a blessing to you, and hope you have a great rest of your day. God bless you.